Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. Welcome to 2017 Sports Industry Global Conference. And my name is Seonyoung Park, and I'll be your MC for today's conference. It's my great honor for me to host this wonderful and meaningful conference, and also I'd like to take this opportunity to deliver my warmest welcome and sincere gratitude to all of you for being here with us today out of your busy schedules. And I believe today's Sports Industry Global Conference will serve as a meeting place to discuss about the main theme of today's conference, which is the expansion of the sports industry through technology. Today, we have invited the experts on sports industry and ICT and big data who have come all the way to here from abroad to share their perspectives and their insights regarding expansion of the sports industry through technology by scientific techniques and the fourth industrial revolution. After opening ceremony, there will be one keynote speech and 3 presentations under different theme. And also every time when you finish the presentation, we'll have discussion session. So discussion session will be preceded by questions previously handed in. To have animated discussion, I'd like to kindly encourage your active participation. Also today, we also have officers from the Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism here with us, and they have emphasized all along that they will keep their ears open on the ideas from the participants today throughout the conference. So, we'll share your ideas throughout the conference, and your point of views and suggestions will be a good stepping stone for being reflected in policy making for our domestic sport enterprises in near future. So here we have many prominent guests here with us today. So especially before we begin to introduce our distinguished speakers and moderators and panelists, I'd like to introduce today's host of this wonderful event, Young-Oh Park, President of Korea Institute of Sports Science. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a big round of applause. And we have another special guest here, Byung-Chan Jung, Head of Center Korea Institute of Sports Science. Please welcome him with a big round of applause. Now I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Peter Nowak. Please welcome him with a big round of applause. Next, let me introduce session 1 speaker, Kevin Chan. And also, please welcome session 2 speaker, Craig Hill. Please welcome him with a big round of applause. Next, let me introduce session 3 speaker, Brian McDonald. Next, I'd like to introduce the moderator for keynote speech in session 1, Tae-hee Kwak, Professor, University of Michigan Sport Management. Next, let me introduce the moderator for session 2 and session 3, Hyun-Duk Kim, Professor, Gaemyeong University Sport Marketing. Next, please welcome Yu-Gyum Kim, Professor, Seoul National University Global Sport Management. 네, I will introduce him later on when he arrives. Also, and I'd like to introduce Jong-Yoon Kim, the director of Wesley Crest. Also, I'd like to introduce Jong-Chae Kim, the professor of Phil Dickinson University NJ Sports Administration. So far, I have introduced all the speakers and panelists and moderators of the 2017 Sports Industry Global Conference. I know we have more distinguished guests here with us today, but due to time limits, please excuse us that we cannot introduce all the names. So now, Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to introduce the president of Korea Institute of Sports Science, Young-ok Park, once again, who will be giving us her opening remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome her with a big round of applause.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. 우리 한국 말로 하겠습니다. 통역이 될 겁니다. 특별히 저희가 2017년 스포츠 산업 관련해서 거의 마무리 행사로 글로벌 스포츠 산업 글로벌 컨퍼런스를 준비했습니다. 저희가 아마 오늘 특별하신 또 우리 한국 사회에서 정말 관심이 있는 그런 주제에 대해서 나름대로 그 아이디어를 갖고 또 현업에서 뭔가 우리가 가야 되는 길에 어떤 먼저 경험을 하신 그런 분들을 모시기 위해서 이번 그 주제의 연사들을 저희가 모셨습니다. 오늘 이 자리에 오신 유명한 테크놀로지 저널리스트인 미스터 피터 노악, Z1 네트워크의 코파운더이신 미스터 케빈 첸, 또 오스트리아에서 우리보다 먼저 오스트리안 스포츠 테크놀로지 네트워크이라 그래서요. 아마 스포츠하고 그다음에 테크놀로지 그다음에 자본을 갖고 있는 분들을 연결해서 새로운 스포츠 산업의 미래를 아마 준비하기 위해서 하는 그런 네트워크를 이끌어 오신 크래그 힐 씨, 미스터 크래그 힐, 그리고 플로리다의 NHL을 실질적으로 아이스하키의 그 스포츠 애널리틱에서 실제로 경험을 많이 갖고 계시는 수학자 출신인 브라이언 맥도날드 씨, 그리고 사실 우리 한국의 수많은 학자들이 외국에서 또 학위를 하시고 현장에서 그 교수직을 하고 계시는데요. 미시간 대학의 곽대희 교수님, 그리고 그 이름이 좀 기네요. 그 뉴저지 페어레이 디큰슨 대학의 김종채 교수님, 그리고 이제 오늘 우리 한국에서 또 패널로 참석하실 그리고 또 사회를 맡아주실 계명대학교 김현덕 교수님, 서울대학교 김유경 교수님, 웨슬리 캐스트의 김정윤 대표님, 이런 분들이 오늘 여러분과 만나겠습니다. 아마 현장의 맥락과 여러분들이 고민하고 있는 것들 사이에 오늘 컨퍼런스가 정말 좋은 그런 어떤 아이디어를 얻거나 새로운 어떤 질문을 형성시키는 좋은 기회가 되기를 바랍니다. 제가 오늘 행사에 대해서 잠깐 준비한 거를 조금 읽겠습니다. 오늘 저희가 스포츠 산업 분야에 우리가 가졌던 많은 변화와 혁신이 있었습니다. 또 2월 달에 내년 2월 9일에 평창에서 저희가 동계올림픽을 준비하면서 또 동계올림픽의 모토 중에 하나가 ICT 올림픽입니다. 그래서 아마 KT하고 그다음에 미래창조부, 지금 정보통신부가 스포츠하고 IT를 접목시키는 새로운 시도를 아마 2월 달에 여러분 앞에 펼쳐 보일 것으로 생각을 합니다. 이러한 어떤 배경에서 저희 문화체육관광부의 스포츠산업과가 한 3년 정도 전에 만들어졌고, 그다음에 국민체육진흥공단 한국스포츠개발원에서 다 아시는 것처럼 스포츠산업을 직접 현장의 어떤 의견을 들어서 진흥할 수 있는 여러 가지 사업 수단들을 지금 가지고 여러분들을 돕고 있는 그런 상황입니다. 아마 저희가 정부가 생각하는 미래 스포츠 시장의 어떤 창출이나 또 잠재 수요를 또 확대하는 것, 그리고 선도 기업을 육성하는 것, 그리고 그런 것들이 모여서 선순환의 어떤 생태계를 조성할 수 있게 하는 것, 그런 어떤 목표를 이루는 과정에 저희는 아주 아마도 좀 상당히 많이 가야 될 것 같습니다. 그러나 여기 오늘 아침부터 이렇게 모이신 많은 분들을 보고 저희의 열망과 열기와 이런 것들이 우리가 가려고 하는 미래를 좀 더 앞당길 수 있을 것으로 생각합니다. 오늘 이 자리에서 사실은 문화체육관광부에서 지금 아직 도착을 못했습니다만 문체부에서 많은 또 관심을 갖고 도와주셨습니다. 어쨌든 오늘 컨퍼런스에서 여러분들, 저명이사들 그리고 여러분 플로어에 계신 분들이 오늘 또 이 프레젠테이션을 통해서 뿐만이 아니고 네트워크를 좀 만드시면서 여러분들에게 큰 도움이 되는 그런 컨퍼런스가 되기를 바랍니다. 다시 한번 끝으로 오늘 이 자리에 발표, 토론, 그 다음에 자장을 맡아주신 분들께 감사의 말씀을 올리겠습니다. 여러분 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Nowak Park. Please give her one more round of applause once again. And she is addressed about the goal and the purpose of this conference for future sports industry. So now let us get started with a keynote speech. And you ain't seen nothing yet, because our next speaker is going to talk about all the wonders that lie in your head. He's going to tell us how technology is growing sports around the world. Peter Nowak, technology journalist, the author of Humans 3.0. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome him with a big round of applause.
Okay, thank you. Hello. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for having me here today at the Global Sports Industry Conference. I hope everybody is looking forward to having an interesting conference today and learning a lot of things that perhaps we didn't know before. It's an honor and a privilege to be here to be giving the keynote address. I'm going to be talking about how technology is changing and potentially growing the sports industry. My goal is to give a bit of an overview. I can't possibly talk about everything specifically, so I'm going to throw a lot of things out there at once, and then hopefully we can get into some more details throughout the day. Before we get to that, I thought it would be a good idea to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a journalist. I live in Toronto. I work mainly for the Globe and Mail, which is Canada's national newspaper, as well as the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the CBC. Sometimes we refer to that as Canada's BBC because everybody knows what the BBC is, but nobody knows what CBC is. I also write a weekly technology column for the national newspaper in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, and I've written 2 books, both of which are actually available here in South Korea. The latest is Humans 3.0, the upgrading of the species. And I bring this up not because I'm trying to do a cheap plug for my book, but because it does actually have some relevance to what we're going to be talking about today, and we'll get to that in a minute. As far as sports go, I wouldn't say I'm a huge sports fan. In fact, back in Canada, a lot of my friends, they say I'm anti-Canadian because I don't like hockey. I can't explain why I don't like hockey, but I've always actually preferred baseball. I'm actually pretty fanatical about baseball. I've loved baseball since I was a young child, and I've recently rediscovered it ever since my beloved Blue Jays started to finally win again, except, of course, this year, which is, of course, the first year in which I bought season tickets to the Blue Jays. Funny story about that is earlier this year, some of my wife's friends actually asked us, this was back in February, just after I had bought my season tickets, if we wanted to go with them on vacation to Tanzania to go on an African safari. And the only problem was they said that they were going in October last month. And of course, back in February, I said, there's no way we can go because the Blue Jays are going to be playing in the World Series. And that seems really funny in retrospect because they ended up finishing 1 game out of last place. So, joke's on me. Anyway, I have bought my season tickets again for next season. I hope the Blue Jays will do better because they obviously can't do much worse. Anyway, I'm Canadian, so one of the things you probably know about Canada right now is that our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, is quite popular. And it's not surprising, really. He's young, good-looking, and he's all those things that the guy who's leading the country south of us isn't, which is that he's a nice person. One other thing you might know about Prime Minister Trudeau is that he likes flashy socks. He like these Chewbacca socks that he's wearing here. He always wears colorful socks. So in honor of Mr. Trudeau and in honor of my hometown, I'm actually wearing my Blue Jays socks today. Okay. So before we get to sports and technology, I think we need to set the table a little bit, take a broad look at what's going on in the world. And the sports industry is actually in a very good position, I believe, today because of the larger global context in which it operates. So the theme of my book, Humans 3.0, is that the world is actually in better shape today in many ways than it ever has been. And I know that's a very surprising statement given some of what's happening in the world today, currently. But if you look at the data, in a lot of ways, this really is the best time ever to be alive. Two of the biggest reasons for that, and this applies to the sports industry as well, is the global economy and the global health situation. So I want to talk about a little bit about the global economy first, because there's a lot of good news here. So way back in the year zero, or almost 2018 years ago, economists estimate that the global economy was worth about 102 billion international dollars. That's the fictional currency that they use to make such comparisons. As you can see from the chart, by the end of the 19th century, that had grown to $1.1 trillion, an increase of almost 1,000%. By the 20th century, the end of the 20th century, it was $33 trillion, another 3,000% increase. By 2013, it was $70 trillion, another doubling. And then by 2030, about 12 years from now, it's expected to once again double to $143 trillion. So there is no end in sight to this astronomical economic growth. And as we see over the relatively recent time period, it's accelerating quite quickly. Now, what this actually means in real terms is that the world is coming out of poverty at an incredible rate. The proportion of people who are living in extreme poverty in the world fell by half between 1990 and 2010, according to the United Nations. That's 20 years, only 20 years, in which the number of people who are extremely poor was cut in half, which I think is pretty incredible. Much of this happened in China and in India, but the effects have been felt outside of Asia as well. Outside of Asia, the poverty rate actually fell from 41% in 1981 to 25% in 2008. So this amazing growth is resulting in some of our leaders having some pretty bold predictions. Nobel Prize-winning economist Edward Prescott says the whole world is going to be rich by the end of this century. This guy you might recognize, Microsoft founder Bill Gates, he says by 2035 there will be almost no poor countries left in the world. That's a pretty aggressive estimate because 2035 is really not that far away. Now, no one should be under the impression that this is all happening easily or smoothly. You just have to look around at the world and see what's happening right now to see that this is happening unevenly. And I think many of the problems that we have in the world today can be traced back to inequality, economic inequality, which is on the rise almost everywhere as a result. Much of the division that we're seeing in places like the United States, the UK, and in Europe is the result of this rising inequality. So the challenge of our time, I think, is to resolve this inequality, preferably quickly and hopefully peacefully. The only consolation is that this isn't something that has never happened before. This is actually a cycle that often recurs. And the last one we had was roughly about a century ago. And it resolved itself in good ways and bad. We had the Great Depression followed by a series of devastating conflicts, all of which was unbelievably terrible. On the upside, though, we did learn a lot from those situations. from those tragedies, and many countries actually emerged socially transformed for the better. Unemployment insurance, student loans, civil rights, more gender equality, all of these came about as responses to the effects of the previous cycle of inequality. And a lot of the prosperity that we've enjoyed over the past century, as we saw in the earlier slide, is actually a direct result of those changes. So we do need to do our utmost to ensure that we can somehow try to get through this current cycle without resorting to the destruction that we've seen in the previous cycles. I'm hopeful that we can do it. And that notwithstanding, I think, again, we have to consider the overall course of history. And in the world's economic direction continues to point upward, and that's a good thing, I think. Now, I mentioned the other strong factor, the strong positive factor for the future of the sports industry is the global health situation. And just as with the economic situation, overall health trends are also very positive. On a very basic level, life expectancy is up dramatically over time. 200 years ago, the average American could expect to live to about 39 years old. Today, it's double that, it's about 78. And that's the same in most developed countries, including here in South Korea, where people are living longer than Americans. And life expectancy is not just increase is not just happening in advanced countries, it's also happening very quickly in developing countries. And that's mostly because infant mortality is dropping quickly. In some African countries, as a matter of fact, infant mortality is falling by as much as 8% per year, which is pretty amazing. So what you're seeing is that the life expectancy gap between rich and poor countries is dropping quickly. In 1950, in advanced countries, the life expectancy gap between advanced countries and developing countries was 22 years. Currently, that gap is now shrunk to about half of that, 11 years. This isn't just because infant mortality is the infant mortality is decreasing. It's also obviously because people are living longer, and a big reason for that is the things that kill us are changing. So in 1900, over a century ago, the top 3 killers of Americans were pneumonia, tuberculosis, gastrointestinal infections. Today, the top 3 are heart disease, cancer, non-infectious lung disease. The big difference between these two is today, the top killers are non-infectious. They're environmental, self-inflicted, or genetic. In other words, they're more treatable or even preventable. This is why life expectancy is continuing to go up no matter where you live in the world. The United Nations actually expects this increase to go on without any upper limit. As you can see, this is from a study the UN did a little while ago, and this is actually, I think, a conservative estimate because it only takes into account natural progression. It doesn't take account the numerous scientific and technological developments or efforts that are underway that are specifically aimed at extending life expectancy. You have to assume that some of those are going to bear fruit, or at least we should hope that they do. So just as with the economy, this isn't happening without a downside. As I'm sure everybody knows, obesity is also on the rise in many countries. We're ironically going from a population that eats too little to a population that eats too much. Now, obesity is, of course, not just an issue about eating. It's also an issue that comes into play when it comes to exercise and sports. And it's also about inactivity. Many of us are unfortunately living sedentary lifestyles where we sit behind desks and behind computers. And also a lot of us, I can't talk about technology without also bringing up one of the negatives of it, in that it does tend to sometimes make us lazier. I know it does for me. Technology has definitely made me lazy in a lot of situations. I don't know how many people have robot vacuum cleaners. I have 2. And I thought that they would make my house cleaner, they would make my life easier, but in fact they've made me lazier because I can't even be bothered to push that button to make it go. So this is one of the downsides of technology. We have to be careful with it, that it doesn't actually increase our laziness. Okay, so let's put all of that together. An improving economic situation across much of the world means a number of things. It means that when people have an easier time providing the basics for their families, they have more time and resources for leisure activities. That can result in a lot of things. It means you can read more books, so you can watch more TV shows, you can watch more movies, you can go to concerts, and so on. It also means you have more time to watch, play, and otherwise engage in sports. More prosperity, therefore, means a larger sports market. And that's good news, I think, for everyone here today. Longer lives and better health are also big positives for the sports industry, because they also mean people have a greater ability to partake in sports and for a greater portion of their lives. Now, even obesity can be seen as a positive because, as we know, the best cure for obesity is often exercise. And cynics may disagree with me on this point, but I think people are starting to understand this. Even Americans who live in what is classified the most obese developed nation in the world, according to the OECD, seem to be understanding this. If you look here, daily participation rates in exercise and sports are actually going up in the United States. About 20% of Americans today participate in some form of daily exercise, and that's up from about 16% in 2003. 20% is still pretty low, but the important thing here is that it's growing, and it's a start. Also encouraging is the fact that participation in the US in almost every sports category has been going up over the past 5 years. So the good news, or the takeaway here, is that sports participation is very closely linked to sports spectating, and those two are actually symbiotic. To give you a really good example, I'll bring up once again my beloved Blue Jays. This was a team that was miserable for the longest time. We won the World Series in 1992 and 1993, and then for 22 years, which I think is a record, they did not make the playoffs until that miraculous year 2015, 2 years ago, when they finally made it back to the playoffs. Now, you have to look at what's happened to baseball in Canada since then. Last year, there were more than 120,000 people playing baseball in Canada, which is an increase of 14% over the year before. A 14% increase in 1 year is pretty incredible, and I think that speaks to the proof of what happens when you have successful sports in a country that inevitably leads to more participation in those sports. So I think what we're seeing now is we're seeing a number of big sports leagues trying to expand globally. You have, especially in the US, you have the National Football League and the National Basketball Association making some inroads into Asia. So I think the outcome is pretty easy to predict. More people are going to play sports because more people are going to watch sports, and vice versa. So as a result, in North America, you have steady growth over the next few years predicted for the sports industry, from $64 billion in 2015 to $75 billion in 2020. I think the more interesting forecast, though, is in China, where the sports industry is expected to not just grow, but I would classify this as an explosion. That's more of a tripling of its value over the next few years. And if we use China as a proxy for the developing world, you can see how much the sports market is going to grow as the world becomes more prosperous. So again, to summarize, I think as this all shows, it doesn't matter where you are or where you live, the future market opportunity for sports is looking very, very good. So that brings us to technology. Now, it's worth noting that many of the economic advances that we've talked about, as well as the health advances, are actually due to technology. Technology has been a very big motivator and enabler of all of that growth. Developments in transportation and communications technology over the centuries have particularly been instrumental in opening up new markets and globalizing the world. Meanwhile, scientific breakthroughs in medicine, as well as food and sanitation technologies, have greatly helped us live longer and more healthier lives. I go into these subjects in my book in quite a bit. So if you're interested, I recommend reading it, and that is my cheap plug. But for right now, I'd like to get into some of the more current technologies that are going to change and expand sports. And I think here we have to start with streaming. Oops. Because this is the technology area I think that is going to have the biggest impact on how people watch sports over the next few years. As I said earlier, a lot more people are going to watch sports soon thanks to streaming. And as we know, watching is closely tied to participating. What's notable here is that the big American technology companies, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Twitter, as well as a few Chinese companies like Tencent and Alibaba, they're coming at the sports market in a big way. So if you just take a look at some of these deals, these are, I believe, over the last 2 years. These are some of the deals that some of these companies have signed for sports rights. So the number of these deals is increasing, but also interesting is the value of the deals is increasing. So a great example is Twitter. Last year, they acquired the rights to Thursday night National Football League games. There was 10 games Thursday nights. The company paid $10 million for those rights. This year, Amazon bought the same rights for $50 million. So Amazon basically paid 5 times more than what Twitter did a year earlier. There's a couple of reasons why this is happening, but the biggest is advertising. Now, Google and Facebook in particular have done an excellent job in capturing the lion's share of the digital advertising market. In the United States, they have approximately 63% of the market between them. Globally, the digital ad market is worth about $533 billion, and these two companies have about 20% of that, which is really staggering when you think about it, about such a large market that two companies have such a large chunk of it. So this is why they don't have a lot more room to grow, especially in North America. In North America, these two companies can't really take more of that market without increasing the danger of government and regulators getting involved and starting to talk about things like duopoly. This is already starting to happen, actually. So they're looking at new markets, and sports is one of those. The global sports advertising market is estimated at about $532 billion, which is about the same size as the digital ad market. So at least one expert expects this to happen. Dennis Denninger, he's a professor at Syracuse University, he's a former producer for ESPN. He believes that either Google or Amazon is going to become the major rights holder of one of the big sports in the US. So in other words, rather than a traditional network like CBS or Fox having the full rights to football, basketball, or hockey, it's going to be one of these technology giants. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not going to be able to watch sports on traditional TV, but it does mean that we're also going to be able to watch them on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Amazon, and so on. These are global platforms, and they're available to anyone with an internet connection. And because these companies are primarily interested in the advertising dollars, I think that they're going to make these games viewable for free. That's what they've been doing so far. So it's hard to understate how big of a shift this is going to be. Live sports available to pretty much anyone in the world for free. The sports industry, I think, is going to change dramatically because of this over the next decade. And this is likely going to be bad news for the status quo, but I think it's going to be an overall plus for the industry because the exposure of sports is going to explode in size and reach. And just as a side note, Google and Facebook and Amazon, these are companies that have disrupted pretty much every industry that they've gone into. And now these companies are so huge that they're serious contenders in whatever market they decide to get into. Okay, so we're going to move on from streaming. Probably the hottest trend in technology today is artificial intelligence, so we have to talk about that for a bit. But one quick note before we get into it is when you speak to academics and scientists who work in this field, a lot of them really don't like the term artificial intelligence or AI. because of the images it conjures. And especially in the West, when you mention artificial intelligence or AI, this is usually what you think of. Which is unfortunate because the AI that we're currently dealing with is closer to this. Many scientists prefer to talk about it as machine learning, and I have to agree that this is a better term for what's happening right now. This is basically where a computer can learn from existing data and suggest a course of action, which is a far cry from the Terminator. Machine learning, or if you really insist, we can call it AI, is currently infusing almost every industry that you can think of, from banking and law to shopping and even photography. And it's happening because three things have come together. The first is you have really powerful computers, not just individual computers, but networked computers that can draw on each other's power. So the ability to crunch data now is astronomical. You also have better algorithms. These are the rules and the training, or sort of the rules under which computers work with. And these are naturally created by humans. And humans have actually got pretty good at writing those algorithms. Now, computers can be really powerful and they can have really good rules to work with, but they're only as good as the data that they're trained on. And this is the third pillar of what's happening here, we are producing incredible amounts of data now for these computers to train themselves on. So the result is that you have computers that can now quickly learn tasks and deliver actually useful results or suggestions. And as I said, the results are being felt in every industry, and this includes sports. Here's a good example of how sports is being applied, of how AI is being applied to sports. Okay, so I don't know if it's obvious how machine learning was used in that clip. That was basically highlights. Those are highlights from this year's US Open. And they weren't actually compiled by a person. They were actually compiled by a computer. In fact, it was compiled by IBM's Watson. You might remember Watson as the computer that defeated some humans in the TV show Jeopardy a few years ago. Since then, IBM has been using Watson in some pretty useful ways. It's helping doctors and lawyers to get their to work on their case files or for their diagnoses and so on. And obviously, it's also helping people compile sports highlights. How it works is actually pretty interesting. Basically, IBM's scientists they used Watson to rank about 26,000 match points at the US Open. And it was creating highlight videos within 2 minutes of the match ending. And then it was pushing those highlights to fans' phones, and fans could watch those highlights within minutes of the match ending. And how they did this was they trained Watson by teaching it how to recognize certain camera angles, crowd noise, excitement from the commentators' voices. They even taught it to see the fist pumps that the players would do. And then they fed it all sorts of older tennis footage, so they got a system that could reliably identify the highlights and put them together. So you can imagine that doing that is something that would take a human many hours to do. So the benefit to those human editors is that they're now freed up to do something more creative or more worthwhile. The Watson is basically doing the grunt work of sifting through all of that footage just to find the interesting parts. one further note on IBM and Watson. Just last week, they announced a partnership with ESPN where they're now applying Watson's machine learning to fantasy football pools. So if you are in one of those pools, you can now basically have a robot that tells you, that will look at, analyze players, analyze their previous histories. It can look at the upcoming matches, what stadiums they're playing in, and so on, and give you a relatively accurate prediction as to how that player is going to do, and then you can decide whether you should keep that player in your pool or put them on the bench for the week. I don't know how well it's going to work, but we're going to see. We're going to see, obviously. Another example of AI being used in sports. This is in a very different way. This comes from Microsoft, which recently announced something it's calling the Sports Performance Platform. So this is a system that takes data from a number of sources, including the wearable physical trackers that track athlete performance and so on. And it collects all of that data and adds up all that data, and then the machine learning takes over and studies the data to try to give you useful advice. So the idea here is it can study an athlete's hydration level, to how much sleep they get, and predict when they might get injured, so that it can tell coaches and athletes, hey, this person should be drinking more water, or this person should maybe not be doing as many sprints, and so on. So what it's trying to do is it's trying to deliver on the early promise of wearables. A few years ago, everybody went out and bought Fitbits. I don't know how many people own Fitbits or smartwatches and so on, but the trend kind of fizzled because a lot of these things would just track your data, and then that was it. It wouldn't really tell you what to do with that data. So this is another situation where somebody is trying to create something useful out of that data, and I think we're going to see a lot more of this. A number of leagues and a number of teams have already adopted Microsoft's platform. That includes Cricket Australia, Benfica, and Seattle Reign Football Club. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that sort of thing. We have to also talk about virtual reality. It is another one of these hotter technologies out there right now. I'm not going to talk about it too much, though, because one of our sessions this afternoon is going to go into further depth on that, I think. There's a few things I do have to talk about, though. For the most part, we've seen virtual reality used in video games and entertainment, but according to some of the sales numbers and the usage numbers, it doesn't appear to be really taking off there as many had hoped or expected. And I think there's a few reasons for this. The technology itself, with the higher end systems, they're still quite expensive. You do need computers that are very powerful, so those are expensive as well. So the cost is twice, it's expensive on two different levels. And also, making it or using it makes some people queasy. My wife uses virtual reality, and she sometimes gets queasy from it. I've actually done it myself and almost vomited, so I think there's still some work to be done there. My personal opinion, too, is that I also just don't think, I think the headsets are still too bulky. I don't think people want to wear these things on their faces for extended periods of time. And the other problem with virtual reality is you often look really silly when you're doing it. That said, virtual reality does have a lot of industrial, enterprise, and medical applications where the benefits of the technology outweigh those negatives. And I think in sports is actually one of them. One interesting application that we're seeing is concussion detection. So in the United States, in Iowa State University, there's a VR company called SyncThink, and Iowa State University is using their headset, which is called iSync VR. They're using it to track players' eyes to see if their brains are working correctly after post-concussion. I think this is interesting because it's not necessarily giving the players a virtual experience. I think that's technically optional, but they're using the same technology to actually assess their health, which is a novel way of using this technology. So I think we're going to see a little bit more of this sort of thing. Now, there's another more direct use of virtual reality.
This is gun trips left, 22 Mike, F Hunt, X Dog wide.
Did you have to memorize all these? Hey, I'm Kurt Wagner with Recode. We are here right in the heart of Silicon Valley. We're a short drive from Stanford and Facebook and Google. We found a much smaller startup. It's called Striver, and they train athletes, both college and pro, using virtual reality. they can actually put themselves in the game without taking the physical punishment. Check it out.
Football, American football is the core. We've seen guys that couldn't practice because of injury. Can I come into VR, put the headset on? I actually can go through my footwork at 10% speed and really get that, 1/10 of the physical rep, but 100% of the mental rep. That mental edge is oftentimes, what separates the pros from the Joes.
We are with Kevin Hogan, former Stanford quarterback, Rose Bowl champ.
Much of the quarterback's job happens before the ball's even in play.
Gotcha.
And that's something that a lot of people don't really realize.
Which is why this helps.
Which is why this helps.
Was this filmed when you were the quarterback? Like, are these your guys right here?
Yeah, these are some of my guys. I wasn't the quarterback in this particular rep.
Yeah, that doesn't look like you. I feel incredibly tiny. Actually, this guy looks a little bit smaller than me. I'm snapping. I'm looking to my far left. That guy slides over. Right there. Boom. Boom. There was number 4 way over there. There was my running back covered. So I made the right choice.
You made the right choice.
So you guys don't just work with people like Kevin.
Yeah, so we built a virtual hockey goalie simulator.
Now, do any actual pro goalies use this bad boy, or is it
No,
just
this
for
is more
fun?
of a fan-facing initiative, but now you can look up on the Jumbotron, wave your arms around, squat up and down.
Hey,
That's you.
What's up? Here comes the guy.
Now, the cool thing about this, Kurt, is you're actually seeing real video of real hockey players.
Oh my
So
god.
these are not video game graphics shooting at you.
So this is real?
It's real.
Like these are like coming right at my throat. Oh my gosh.
That was close.
I like that one. That one was fun.
It's neat. It's really, really fun.
It's actually got me.
Oh yeah, you get into it. A lot of people say it's the best VR they've ever seen.
Yeah.
Not necessarily because we have the most amazing graphics on demand. They're really good. But again, like ergonomically, you're doing something real. It's not kind of a made-up experience, right? So that it has a very, very strong impact on people.
That's saved.
That's a wrap. Thanks for hanging.
Okay, so as we can see there, this company, Striver, they're using VR to help train football quarterbacks and potentially hockey goalies down the road on how to do their jobs better. One thing that wasn't mentioned in that video is this is a useful tool for athletes to recover from injuries, again, going back to concussions. In a lot of cases, when athletes have injuries, you hear them talk about how it's not necessarily the physical problem or the physical part of the game that they have to get back into, it's the mental part as well. And this is a technology, again, because it is virtual, it allows them to experience or to start rehabbing or retraining again sooner, at least on a mental level, even if they can't go physically. So that's kind of an interesting development there. So again, this is, again, another technology where I think we're going to see more applications of it in sports, especially in sports recovery from injuries and that sort of thing. So I won't say any more about VR because we're going to hear a lot more about that this afternoon, I hope. One last technology that I do want to touch on before we wrap things up is augmented reality, sort of really related to virtual reality. In a nutshell, AR combines a camera and a screen of some sort to project interactive computer graphics or images onto what is otherwise the real world. The biggest AR success we've seen so far was Pokemon Go last year. This was, of course, the mobile phone sensation. It was a game that let you catch virtual monsters on your phone. These monsters were hiding in the real world. It grossed more than $1 billion for its creator, Niantic Labs. So this is why a lot of analysts are predicting that AR is going to be bigger than VR. Worldwide revenues for both are expected to increase by more than 100% for at least each of the next 4 years, from 11 billion this year to 215 billion in 2021. And about 80% of that is expected to be AR, VR making up the remaining 20%. The reasoning for this is simple. As Pokemon Go showed, the only hardware you need for augmented reality is a phone, which almost everybody already has. And most importantly, you don't have to wear anything on your face. Although that's actually not stopping some companies from developing AR headsets like Microsoft with HoloLens. Apple is also reportedly working on a headset. And of course, we've seen some other attempts there. My personal opinion is that just like with VR, these augmented reality headsets are going to have more niche applications. And I think sports is actually going to be one of those valuable niches because it actually makes a lot of sense. When you're playing sports or when you're engaging a lot of sports, you need to have your hands free, in which case a headset can be really handy. So in that vein, there's at least one very cool application that we're seeing. This is in golf from a German company called Viewlicity. Their product is called PuttView, and it's used in conjunction with Microsoft's HoloLens. And as you can see, it's pretty clear. You wear this thing, and when you're putting, and it can give you things like range and all sorts of interesting data about what you're trying to do, trying to get the ball in the hole. The possibilities for AR with consumers, I think, are also going to be pretty exciting. As a baseball fan and as a technology geek, I can't wait to use Major League Baseball's augmented reality app that's coming out, apparently coming out next season. So this is a stat geek's greatest dream come true because you can hold your phone up to the field and you can see all sorts of interesting information about the players and what's going on with the game. It's going to display in real time how hard a ball was hit, what speed pitchers are throwing at, how fast the runners are running, if they're breaking any records, and so on and so on. I already watch baseball games with my phone in one hand so that I can quickly look up statistics. So this is going to be really exciting for me, and I suppose it's going to be really exciting for a lot of people too. The only limitation to augmented reality, I think, is that it's not going to be able to explain to me why the Blue Jays are so terrible. That's unfortunately just real reality. Okay, so I think we've covered a lot of ground there over the last 30 minutes, and I hope that at least some of what I talked about was interesting and that everyone learned something that they didn't know. When I give these talks, I try to convey a sense of positivity and optimism, largely because we journalists have a tendency to only focus on the negative, the bad news, and what's going wrong in the world. And that's important, of course, because that, uncovering those negative things is what helps society function properly. But in this day and age, there's so much media out there, and so much of it is negative, and you add in social media. I think it's important to counterbalance that with some of the positives and some of the good things that are happening too. And I think this actually meshes well with the whole purpose of sports. No one plays sports or watches sports because they hate them. We exercise and we play sports to become healthier and more fit and to build relationships with our friends and teammates, and also because it's a lot of fun. We watch sports for similar reasons, because we build bonds with our friends, our cities, even our countries, and also, of course, because it is often thrilling and fun. It can also be disappointing and painful, but I think that actually helps us to accept and deal with defeat, and it makes us better people in the end. So that's the message I'd like to close with today, is that the future looks good for both sports and the sports industry. It's set to grow, and I think technology is going to help it do so in many ways, which means it's going to help us watch and to participate. So in the end, it's going to improve our enjoyment of one of the most enjoyable things that we have today. Thank you very much, and I look forward to taking some of your questions.
Thank you, your enlightening speech, Peter. And also at this point, we'll conduct a discussion session with this topic, and I'd like to ask Tae-hee Kwak, a professor, University of Michigan Sport Management, to come up to the stage after we set up the stage for discussion session. So Peter, please remain on the stage for a while. Thank you. And also, as you know, the JETRO CEO, Ion Communications, was supposed to be here with us today as a panelist for this event. But unfortunately, as you know, he, due to the natural disasters in Bali, actually he went to the business trip to Bali, and the flight has been canceled. So please excuse us and for him to not to be here with us today. Right, and please have a seat, Peter. Now, are we ready, Mr. Kwok?
Good morning. Thank you for the introduction. It's unfortunate that we miss Mr. Oh Jae-chul to join us as a discussant this morning. But in the light of Peter's positivity, it will be an opportunity for us to ask more questions and hear more from Peter. So for our discussion, I'd like to start by talking about the Peter's book. I read the Human 3.0, which I thought was really fascinating, which covers a lot of domains, how technology is really influencing today's society and how it changes us as a human being at various levels. And also today's presentation, he touched a lot of topics from global economy to the poverty rates to the technology. He went into the AR, VR, and other elements of technology to really open our eyes up into the role of sport, the technology in sport. I will take the negativity side to get this conversation a little bit more engaging. So the Peter talks about the positive, the future of the technology, influence of technology in the sport industry. But I'd like to talk a little bit more from his book and talk to start off my first question. So you talk about global economy and life expectancy. So you mentioned about the growth of the global economy and how there will be almost no poor countries left in 2035, according to Bill Gates. That's certainly it could be an optimistic prediction, but at the same time makes one to wonder, what does that mean for an ordinary individual living as a middle class? So we see this positive changes in the global economy, prolonging life expectancy at the same time. The poverty rates are decreasing, which is great. So the world is changing, but I want to look at my reality, living day to day with a paycheck. My paycheck isn't increasing. And I'd like to add a little bit more to this by to add a little bit more context about Korea. When I first came to Korea, meeting a lot of friends and folks, they don't have time. The Korean economy, it's the fourth largest in the world, fourth largest in Asia, and the 11th largest in the world. The economy indicates we are becoming a wealthier country, but at the same time, we are the longest working, we work longest hours, and it's difficult to have time with a family. With that said, I'd like to ask you, I'd like to hear your thoughts on, yes, the global economy, all these positive indicators that we see, and what would be your response for someone that would come to you, okay, Peter, yes, there are things that are changing, but I really like to use my discretionary time and income for this meaningful exercise or sport, but I just don't have time for that. What would be your response for that question?
Good question. Lots of possible ways to answer that. I guess the first thing I'd say is when I was working on this book and writing this book and coming to some of these conclusions, I have to say they were very difficult conclusions to believe. When you would see things going on in the world and see all this negativity and as you say, experience the reality of it. I don't feel rich myself. I don't know if you do, but I certainly don't. So it was difficult to actually believe in some of what I was actually saying myself. But I think the important thing is even when I was a really young child in school, I was always very fond of studying history. And I think that was the important thing, is to put it in a historical context. Again and again, I think it's impossible to say otherwise that this is not the best time in history to be alive.
So I'll have a follow-up question on that one.
Sure.
As we face, I told you in the morning when we chat a little bit, the reality that we are facing. North Korea just shot another missile, and we have these two powerhouses, USA and the UK. Seems like the regime is in the direction, it's not in the favor of promoting human 4.0 from your book. It's becoming more divisive, or it's not really promoting the agenda of the unity or inclusiveness. With that said, what do you think is the role, what do you think is the value of sport in this conflict-filled society? And if you can answer what the value is, if you can elaborate a little bit more on what specific values that you see.
Yep. Yeah, so just one last thought on that is, again, it is difficult to believe that things are good when things are obviously not good. But to address your more immediate question of what's the value in sports, I think that's the whole point of the Olympics and all the various international competitions, is similarly in a completely different vein. It's the point of the International Space Station, is that these are the things that are supposed to bring us together and to be able to, specifically in sports, to compete against each other in a friendly and non-threatening and safe manner. So I think that is something that is more important today than I think it ever has been. There's been a lot of talk that the Olympics, because there's so much baggage associated with the Olympics, economic baggage, there's been corruption scandals and so on. I think the Olympics are more valuable today than they perhaps ever were. Same with other international competitions. How we can stress those, how we can make those a little more important, I don't know. But I think that's the whole point of sports, is when you play a sport, the whole idea of it is, from a micro level to a macro level, is that you're supposed to be either working with your team or you're competing against somebody in a, a friendly manner. So I think that's kind of the role. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that's what sports should be striving for.
Excellent. And at the end of your book, you talk about you consciously make an effort to go out and join the team and play sport. And if you can, I think that alludes to what you just mentioned. With the technology, everything is so convenient. Everything is in your fingertip. Makes you lazier with the robotic, the vacuum. As you mentioned, it's about making those conscious effort to go out and take your time, and you prioritize what is important or meaningful in your life, and you choose to play sport. So I want to bring my next question to the technology component within the sport. You first mentioned about the streaming. So now we see Amazon, Twitter, YouTube in the bidding war on the broadcasting rights. So mobile commerce company or social media company is now broadcasting live sporting events in North America. So with that said, last week, ESPN laid off hundreds of additional anchors and reporters, which means people are cutting cords and move onto the streaming, the platform. So that creates another the issue here, which opens up an opportunity for digital streaming. So as a journalist, what is your take on this changing media platform and moving, the consumers are moving into the direction where they are viewing sports on their handy devices?
Yeah, well, I think, as I mentioned in the keynote, I think it's a positive in terms of how people can access these sports, view sports. Just to give you my own personal experience, I got rid of my cable many years ago. And one of the last appeals that cable companies, television companies still have is that they're the last place where you can watch sports. But you have to pay a lot of money to get that. You know, in Canada, it's something like $70 a month at least to have a cable subscription to watch your sports. So when these companies are coming, when it's Google or Facebook or whatever, they're offering it at a much cheaper, if not free. So on that level, it's great. And it's going to be available to everybody, supposedly. Now, of course, we're learning that there's many downsides to dealing with companies like Google and Facebook, because they are obviously sucking up all of our information, all of our data, and in some ways that's not a very good thing. It's having many negative effects. I think so on that front, I think those are kind of two separate issues. I'm not quite sure, again, if I'm answering your question, but I think it's a good thing.
So I'll continue a question with the media and sport.
Actually, can I jump in again? One thing that's one really bad thing, I think, out of all of this is when you look at any industry. I mentioned again in the speech that whatever industry that these companies decide to enter, they become very big, serious threats to the existing companies. Whether it's been books or movies or music, whatever. All these companies have come in and quickly become very dominant in those fields. And so now if they're looking at sports and sports streaming, this is what you mentioned with ESPN laying people off. It's going to be very difficult for local companies, whether it's broadcast networks like ESPN or whether it's cable companies, TV providers. I'm not sure how those companies are going to be able to compete against Google and Amazon and Facebook, because in most other industries that these companies have gone into, the existing companies that have been in those businesses have not been able to compete. You're seeing it in retail. Amazon is destroying retail. Stores are going out of business. Shopping malls, at least in North America, actually mostly in the United States, not so much in Canada. Shopping malls are becoming almost wastelands. So you're seeing a lot. Yeah, these are very powerful companies, and that's the downside. Is that I remember seeing a chart not too long ago. I think it was 20 years ago. The top 10 biggest companies in the world according to the stock market valuations, and it was mostly in the top 10. You had a lot of oil companies, and now the top 5, I believe, every single one of them are technology companies, and you can't even really call them technology companies anymore. They're conglomerates because they operate in so many different fields. And sports, I think, as we covered, is next.
Thank you, Peter. As a journalist, sport and media, they can't go separate. It's also a symbiotic relationship, sport and media. People want to consume sport through media, either their social media or traditional media outlets and so on. And you mentioned about Watson and also artificial intelligence, and nowadays the computers can craft an article right after match. As you mentioned, they're compiling all these thousands of clips in 2 minutes. That's just fascinating. But at the same time, that threats also the journalist. What do you see, given the symbiotic relationship between sport and media, the future of sport journalists? There may be some journalists sitting in this room.
Sure. This is actually an area where I'm very optimistic. Even outside of sports journalism, I think AI is going to be great in all kinds of ways and across all kinds of journalism. And as a writer, basically my job is I sit down and I write stories almost every single day. I'll go a little bit further and say one of the jobs I think that every journalist absolutely hates is transcribing interviews. This is sitting down and listening to the interview you did, and it takes hours and it's mind-numbing. There's a few efforts underway. I've tried them all. They're still not very good at doing that automatically. That's going to improve. I have to assume it's going to improve. If that happens, my job will be so much easier. So then you take it to the next level of an AI being able to write your article for you, which also exists. I think it's mostly in like sports game recaps and also like financial stock recaps, that sort of thing. They're very similar. Very easy things to write. That's why AI is doing it. So it's going to, again, improve, and it's going to into all areas. So it's going to basically, AI is going to write the basic story for us. And I think that's where we become, a writer will become more of an editor, which is that we will have this, really basic story written for us, and then we get to work and spend the same amount of time that we would writing that same story, improving it, making it better. With sports, this is actually even more acute, because sports is a very emotional subject, and I don't know if an AI or a computer will ever really capture that. Probably ever is wrong to say, but anytime soon, I don't think so. I have very good friends who are sports writers, and they write such emotional stories that really get you excited, and I think this is a very positive, it's a very big positive. I think it's going to, as in all fields, AI is going to remove some jobs. I know when I started, there was people who would write stories about, here's what the stock did, here's what this company's stock did today, and AI does that now. And that person, if that was their only skill, they don't have a job. But on the other side of it, they were free to move on to write something better, or to write better stories.
Thank you, Peter. I want to move on to the next topic that I want to ask you. Sport analytics, or big data. We have Brian, who will be talking about how the Panthers are using the data into their decision making.
Sorry.
You good? So, sorry I have to bring this up, the Blue Jays. So if the teams are utilizing data analytics to predict better performance, would that give you hope for the Blue Jays to have a much better season next year?
I think it was actually a New York Times article recently. The New York Yankees had fired their manager, and there was talk that he was fired because he was kind of an old school manager. He wasn't really using the analytics, and they wanted somebody who was more in tune with that sort of thing. So that there seems to be some evidence that that's happening, that a lot of the managers in baseball now have to have familiarity with analytics, and that's an interesting, it's kind of an arms race almost. It goes back to Moneyball. Moneyball is probably further than Moneyball, but this is where you started using these advanced statistics to really predict what players can do. So it's an interesting question, because then you have we think of sports as being sort of a raw physical contest, but what happens when you start to have a contest between the teams and their analytics abilities? That's going to be interesting to see how that turns out. And there's been, it's hard to say, because you've seen examples of both. You've seen teams that have succeeded, again, using the Moneyball strategy, teams that have succeeded by having players with stats that you just wouldn't normally think of. But at the same time, you've also had those same teams fail miserably. So I think it's too early to say. Can we put our faith completely in analytics? I'd be curious to hear what Brian has to say. But I think it's too early to say, but it is going to improve. And I'm really interested to see, is this going to lead to a war in analytics between teams? Because now you can look at, say, the real basic analytic, which is this team has a higher budget than this team, so that means their chances of winning are higher. But what happens when you start to get into that secondary level? I don't know.
All right. Thanks, Peter. We very much look forward to hearing what Brian will be delivering later this afternoon on the data analytics. Okay, I want to move on to the next topic. Actually, this was from one of the questions that we received from participants today. We received questions from when they register. There are questions from students to CEOs of startups, from government officers, to ask a variety of questions. I think one of the questions that I really thought interesting was about robotic referees replacing the human referees. I think baseball might be most relevant in that case, where the robots crouching behind the catcher to make the strikes and balls, the calls for strikes and balls. What's your take on on seeing your favorite sport, and you want to make sure that you're not emotionally upset because of the bad call that the umpire has made. But if you have more accurate call, thanks to this technology, what would be your, as a baseball fan, what would be your response to that?
I'm extremely torn on that. On the one hand, yes, that's exactly, because you're watching a game, and but it happens to everybody. Bad calls against every team, and it happens. And those are the situations where I've screamed at my TV so many times, why can't you just have a robot umpire? But then at the same time, I think I am a little bit old school enough to think that the human error is part of the element. It's an element of the game. So I don't know. I honestly don't know which I would prefer. I think I would have to I think we'd have to experiment with it to see which we like better. I'm sure, I think they are using robot umpires somewhere.
They're experimenting with the minor leagues.
Yeah. So I'd like to see what the reactions are, what the data says on that. At the same time, you know, the manager fighting with the umpire, that we'd lose that part of the game too, and that's can be. So a lot of people say baseball's boring, but that's actually one of the most most entertaining parts of the game.
Okay. So let me just check the time. Okay. I'll ask a second question here. Social network services, technology, and how this social media transforms how we consume and create content about sport. And I followed you on Twitter about a couple days ago. I don't know if you noticed. And I met Kevin through LinkedIn the other day. So even before I met you in person, I was able to connect with you at some level. So I could view some of your recent postings and some of the information that you shared on the website. How do you see, from a journalist perspective, social media transforming how content being generated and distributed to stakeholders?
Well, I think this is, obviously sports has been a very big interest area for Facebook and Twitter. I think that's why those two companies in particular have been very active in signing these sports deals. You know, they obviously see any sort of live events, not just sports, but like the Oscar Awards or the Super Bowl, well, Super Bowl sports, the live events. This is something that people like to, you know, basically talk about as it's happening. So that's obviously been a very big attraction for these companies. And I guess this is also goes back to the whole point of, or one of the points why people watch sports is because they want to do it as a community. So that's something that's very, it seems like a natural fit to me. The social networks themselves, though, I think they're experiencing some big problems now. I don't know what the future holds for these companies. You know, whether it's fake news or abuse on Twitter, negativity, all that sort of thing. My understanding, my feeling about Twitter is that it's there's this old rule on the internet. I can't remember exactly what the rule is called, but it's the 99 and 1 rule, which is that 1% of the people who use the internet make content, 9% interact with it, whether it's commenting on it or so on, and then 90% just consume it passively. And I think as far as Twitter is concerned, my feeling is that it's almost like a echo chamber. Most of the people I know are media people. Most Twitter users I know are media people. Very few of my actual friends who are not in the media actually use Twitter. So I don't know what's happening there. I think Twitter is having a lot of problems of any of the social, well, there's not that many social media companies, but it's having a lot of problems. Facebook is, I think, a bit of a different story. That's something where people are still, I think average people are using it. That's not just very niche social network. So I can see Facebook having a lot more interest in sports.
All right, thanks. Move on to the next topic, and I'll share a couple more questions from the question being submitted, and then I'd like to open up to the floor if you have any questions to Peter to make most of our time today. you talk about obesity. And you talked about how exercise or sport participation is closely related with spectating and how they are mutually beneficial. Still, you shared its upward trend where 23% of Americans are participating in some sort of exercise. And I want to ask this from a technology angle where technology can be a distraction. So I have a 3-year-old daughter at home who uses my iPhone to hit the YouTube app and finds her favorite show and watch. And it's an instant gratification at your fingertip. And going back to the context about the Korean society, the busy lifestyle, it's a challenge to really increase the population to get into the sport, get involved with sport, and really appreciate the value of sport. So I don't know if you can answer this question, but we, from the positivist viewpoint, to make this a little bit better place and encourage people to appreciate the value of sport, what would be some of the ideas that you would have, especially for our younger generations?
Yeah, well, obviously education is key. I think it's hard when you're a child to understand why you're being taught things that you're being taught, but physical education was one of, I remember when I was a kid, I was pretty active as a kid, but I just didn't understand why we had gym class. It didn't seem to...
And we didn't have smartphone back then, so
yeah, exactly.
didn't have other options.
Yeah. So I think education, not just teaching kids physical education, but also teaching them why they're learning it, I think is important. But the other thing too, this is something that I find happens a lot, is I think those of us who are older now, I'm 43, and we have a tendency to look at, now that I'm older, I remember when I was a young man, and I would look at the older generation and think, you people don't understand anything. And now that I'm older and looking down at them, I see a lot of people who are my age, my generation, really making all these assumptions about young people that I think are wrong. And one of the things, this is going on a bit of a tangent, but one of the things I always hear is that young people don't read, which is actually not at all true. Young people read more than anybody's ever read. I hear young people don't read newspapers too, which is kind of true. They read a lot on their phones, so they're not actually reading print, but they don't read from newspaper sources. And I think that's also not necessarily true. It is true, but also, I don't think when I was young, I definitely didn't read newspapers. It's something that you grow into, and I think those stats that I showed about the obesity, that was not kids. I believe those stats were 16 and older. So I think, I do believe that physical education, even though you're taught it when you're younger, I think it's something that you actually come to value when you're older. And that's why those numbers that I showed, it's increasing among not older people, but adults. So I think that it's a combination of two things, long answer to your question, which is better education when you're young, again, not just teaching you sports or exercise, teaching you why you need to do it. And then probably when you become a teenager and somebody in your 20s, you're not going to care about those things. You're going to be on your video games, on your smartphone, and so on. But later in your life, those lessons that you learned when you're younger are going to kick in, I think. That's my belief. That's what's happened to me, and I think it's happening to a lot of people, as the statistics appear to be showing.
Thanks, Peter. That leads to my last question. Human 4.0, I don't know if you're working on that project, but you talk about this altruistic, the value that you want to really highlight as you end your book in 3.0. So if you can share with us about where do you see how the human beings are evolving to the next, perhaps next generation. Maybe it's even closer than what we would imagine. But what's your imagination, and what value do you see in a human 4.0? If you can elaborate a little bit more.
Yeah, okay, so I think it's actually been a while since I read my book, so I can't remember everything I said in it. But one of the few things I do remember is one of the things that we've seen, especially over the last century, and this is largely because of technology, is we've seen a growth in individualism. So I think you see this in many ways, especially with economic prosperity, is when we are able to, when we don't have to worry about providing the basics as much as we used to, we're able to look for careers that are more fulfilling and so on. There's the whole hierarchy of needs that you progress through. So I think more of us now are looking for careers and jobs and basically life purpose. So we are slowly advancing, I think, to a more individual-based society. There's problems with that because when you have so many individuals, it's very hard to agree on things. And I think we're seeing that a lot. We're seeing a lot of that now. We're in this period of time where nobody can seem to agree on anything. And that's bad, but I think, again, you have to take a longer view of history. And I think that I'm optimistic that we're going to, this is still new to us, this whole wave of individuality. Once we figure that out, I think we will, I kind of hope that we come closer together. And there's evidence that that is happening too. The opposite is also very, it's also happening too. We've seen that there's a whole chapter in my book that talks about war and how we haven't had any major wars since World War II, I guess. Any major global conflict. And part of the reason for that is growing globalization. So countries have become interdependent on each other, so it's harder for them to go to war. I know it's very weird talking about this right now, but countries are more interdependent today, so it's more difficult to go to war against each other. At the same time, you have all this individuality. So these are two almost conflicting things happening at once. But I think that it's going to eventually, the two are going to come together. I don't know if that's a very good answer.
I hope a sport can play a huge role in that regard. So I'd like to open up to the floor to have question. If you have any question to Peter Nowak about his presentation or some of the topics that have been deliberated during the discussion, please feel free to raise your hand. I think we have a microphone and ready. Yes.
감사합니다. 예, 저는 황한솔이라고 하고요. 지금 판타지 스포츠 관련된 비즈니스를 하고 있습니다. 한국에서. 제가 하고 있는 비즈니스는 단순 그냥 판타지 스포츠라기보다는 이런 드래프트 하는 행위 자체를 스포츠 팬들한테 좀 더 재밌게 그리고 이런 스포츠 마케팅을 통해서 융합하는 그런 사업을 지금 구상하고 있는데요. 제가 생각할 때 피러는 미국의 캐나다에서 아마 야구를 오래 좋아하는 팬이었으니까 판타지 스포츠도 빅팬일 거라고 가정하고 있습니다. 근데 이런 판타지 스포츠를 통해서 저희가 줄 수 있는 그런 행복이나 아니면 어드밴티지나 디스어드밴티지에 대해서 좀 설명해 주실 수 있을까요?
Did you get the first part of the question?
No, I missed some of that.
Okay. The question was fantasy sports. So I think he provides fantasy sports service in Korea, and since it's a fairly new program or service to Korean fans, he wants to let the consumers know the joy of the draft process. It's not just the predicting the outcome, but the drafting process. And he wanted to also hear about the benefits or advantages or disadvantages of fantasy sport as a part of growing the game of baseball. And if you are a fan of you're a fan of baseball, and you also play fantasy baseball, or
yes, yeah, I've been part of many baseball pools, fantasy pools, so I know the joys of it and the grief of it very, very well. I guess the benefits of it is, I think if you were to break it down, it's basically you are trying to prove that you are smarter than your friends or the people that you are playing with, which is all kinds of fun. And it's really weird because it's different. It's not exactly sports. It's It's an academic or an intellectual exercise about something that is ultimately very physical. So I guess it's a combination. It's an interesting combination of the two. It's surprising that I'm surprised to learn that this is relatively new here, because fantasy sports has been going on for a long time in North America. I guess in some ways it's also a form of gambling too, which is also appealing, to a certain extent. I mentioned IBM getting involved with fantasy sports with Watson, so that's another. That almost goes back to your question about the analytics. So, how's that going to work with pools, with your fantasy pool? Is I'm going to come to draft day with my laptop, and I'm going to have an AI telling me, draft this player, don't draft that player. And the other players are not going to have that advantage, if it's an advantage. I don't know. So yeah, this is going to change. Again, AI is going to change how even simple fantasy sports works.
Interesting question, and thank you for the answer. One more question in the back.
예, 안녕하세요. 반갑습니다. 저는 아이서울 브랜즈라는 그 서울시에서 하고 있는 시민 기자단으로 해서 대표로 나왔거든요. 예, 저희 서울시에서 지금 하고 있는 사업 중에 하나가 이게 도서관 짓기와 체육 시설을 늘리는 겁니다. 그러니까 아이들이 PC방에서 끌어내는 게 방법인데 끌어내고 나서 어디로 보낼까가 문제거든요. 근데 그게 결론은 체육 시설이나 체육을 할 수 있는 그 유아 체육이라든지 그런 것들이라고 저는 생각을 하거든요. 근데 그건 저는 이제는 뭐 학교를 뭐 수능으로 가는 것도 당연히 중요하지만 해외처럼 공부도 잘하고 운동도 열심히 해줘야 그리고 이제 그런 친구들이 좋은 리더가 되고 그렇게 따른 거라고 생각을 합니다. 당연히 그런 건 당연히 선진국에서 먼저 하고 계신 것 같고요. 제가 지금 뭐가 관심이 있냐면 아까 전에 말씀하셨던 그 피터가 썼던 책처럼 휴먼 4.0이라는 것이 결론은 모든 것이 데이터, AI, 가정증식 다 좋은데 결론은 사람이 주축이라는 얘기가 가장 메인이라는 느낌이 들거든요. 책을 보진 못했습니다. 50명 안에 못 들었거든요. 일단은 그래서 제가 생각할 때는 그 친구들이 어떻게 그 아이들이 교육을 잘 그런 방과 후에 체육시설 잘 받고 그런 것들의 시설이나 이런 것들에 대해서 저변학대를 할 수 있는 뭐 좋은 예가 있다면, 그러니까 우리 청년들이나 그 어른들의 눈높이의 체육시설이 아닌 그 아이들이 이렇게 발전해 갈 수 있는 체육시설이나 시스템이 있다면 그런 좋은 예를 좀 듣고 싶습니다. 네, 이상입니다. 네. 그리고 혹시 책이 한 권 남는다면 하나 더 받을 수 있을까요? 50명 안에 들어가지고요. 네, 부탁 좀 드리겠습니다. 이상입니다. 네.
Well, I don't know about the book. I don't have any myself, but I'm sure maybe somebody here can set you up. I don't know. I'm not sure if I understood the question. It's how can we use AI to make better after-school programs? That was the question. Yeah. Right. Oh boy. That's something I have not thought of. I don't know. I guess, kids today, without, again, going back on what I said earlier about how we as the older generation have these assumptions about the younger generation that aren't necessarily true. One of them is, they're digital natives. They grew up with all this technology that we didn't necessarily grow up with. So I'm hesitant to say this, but I think that you almost have to incorporate technology into trying to get them interested in the physical world. Augmented reality, I think, is a pretty interesting way to do that. There was a lot of stories last year about how Pokemon Go was inspiring exercise crazes, or people were getting more exercise because they were going out around town and finding things and walking places and so on. So that's an interesting application or interesting side effect of augmented reality. That said, I also saw a story the other day. They did some study that I think Pokemon Go also led to an increase in car accidents because people were blocking the road looking for Pokemon monsters or whatever. Anyways, the point of my answer, I think, is I think that I think it's a good way to appeal to kids is to try to incorporate that technology, and there's a lot of efforts that are doing that. Augmented reality, I think, is a very natural and easy way, and we've already seen it proved that it can actually deliver results.
All right, thank you for the answer. I think we passed time a little bit, so I will wrap this up today. I really appreciate Peter coming here and sharing his thoughts on technology and sport from a journalist perspective, and also sharing content from his book, which is very insightful. So I'd like to once again thank you, and please give a round of applause for Peter Nowak.
Please give one more applause for both of them. There was certainly an enthusiastic discussion. Thank you, Peter and Professor Kwok. So hope it could be a good chance for you to find the correlation of the sports industry with technology under the theme of today's conference, the expansion of the sports industry through technologies. So, ladies and gentlemen, the afternoon session will be started after the luncheon. So now it's time to have a luncheon, and lunch will be served in the lobby, and which is located at the right side as you make your way out. And the second presentation, session 1, will begin at 1 p.m. Don't be late, and thank you, and bon appetit.